In the rugged mountains of Pine Ridge, Montana, Jake Thompson had become a legend that mothers whispered about to keep their children from wandering too far into the wilderness. 3 years of isolation had transformed the once gentle search and rescue specialist into something harder than the granite peaks that surrounded his remote cabin. His truck hadn't been seen on Main Street in months, and when desperate situations forced him down from his mountain sanctuary, folks crossed to the other side of the street rather than meet his cold gray eyes. But when a fierce October blizzard traps single mother Elena Rodriguez and her 2 children on the treacherous old mining road, Jake's world of careful solitude is about to collide with a family fighting for survival, and the mountain man who swore he'd never let anyone close again will discover that sometimes the heart finds its way back to tenderness through the most unexpected circumstances. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. Elena Rodriguez pressed her palm against her forehead as she stared at the eviction notice taped to her front door, the yellow paper fluttering like a surrender flag in the crisp Montana wind. 29 days. That's how long she had before the landlord would put her and her children out on the street, and with winter approaching fast in Pine Ridge, being homeless meant more than just inconvenience, it meant real danger. The diner where she worked double shifts as a waitress barely paid enough to cover groceries, let alone the back rent she owed after missing work when Sofia had pneumonia last month. Inside their small rental house, 9-year-old Sofia sat at the kitchen table working on homework by the light of a single lamp, her dark hair falling across her face as she concentrated on math problems. 7-year-old Tommy played quietly on the worn linoleum floor with toy cars that had seen better days, making soft engine noises as he navigated them around the table legs. Neither child complained about the cold. They'd learned not to ask for things their mother couldn't provide, but Elena noticed how Sofia pulled her sweater tighter, and how Tommy's lips had a slight blue tinge that meant the heat had been turned off again. The medical bills from Sofia's hospital stay sat stacked on the counter like an accusation. $3,000 that might as well have been $3 million given Elena's financial situation. She'd already sold her wedding ring, her mother's jewelry, and everything else of value just to keep food on the table. The divorce had left her with nothing but debt and 2 beautiful children who deserved so much more than the hand-to-mouth existence she was providing. Elena had come to Pine Ridge 2 years ago hoping for a fresh start after her ex-husband disappeared with his secretary and their joint savings account. The small mountain town had seemed like a place where she could rebuild, where her children could grow up safely surrounded by nature instead of the chaos of Los Angeles. But small-town life came with small-town wages, and the cost of living in an isolated mountain community was higher than she'd anticipated. Groceries had to be trucked in over dangerous mountain passes, heating oil cost a fortune, medical care meant a 2-hour drive to the nearest real hospital. The phone rang, startling her from her worried calculations. Dr. Patricia Hayes' familiar voice came through the receiver, warm but concerned. "Elena, honey, I know money's tight, but Sofia really needs to come in for a follow-up appointment. That pneumonia was serious, and I want to make sure her lungs are completely clear." Elena gripped the phone tighter, knowing she couldn't afford another doctor's visit but unable to risk her daughter's health. "I'll figure something out, Dr. Hayes. Maybe next week when I get paid." After hanging up, Elena walked to the kitchen window and stared out at the mountains that surrounded their small town like sleeping giants. Somewhere up there, according to local gossip, lived Jake Thompson, the hermit who had once been Pine Ridge's most respected search and rescue volunteer. Before his wife died in a hiking accident, Jake had saved dozens of lives on these treacherous peaks. Now he was just another ghost story, a cautionary tale about what grief could do to a man's soul. Elena had seen him only once, about 6 months ago when he'd come into the diner late at night during a thunderstorm. He'd sat in the corner booth, ordered black coffee and said nothing while she worked around him, cleaning tables and preparing for the next day's shift. There had been something magnetic and terrifying about his presence, the way he moved with controlled precision, the way his eyes seemed to see everything while revealing nothing. His dark hair had grown wild, his beard was untrimmed, and his clothes carried the scent of wood smoke and mountain air. When he left, he'd placed exact change on the table without a word, disappearing back into the storm like he'd never been there at all. Maria Santos, Elena's elderly neighbor, had filled in the details later while they shared coffee on Elena's back porch. Jake Thompson had been a different man before tragedy struck. He'd been married to Rebecca, a nature photographer who'd captured the beauty of Montana's wilderness with her camera. They'd been Pine Ridge's golden couple, he with his heroic rescue work, she with her artistic vision and gentle spirit. They'd talked about having children, about building a life together in the mountains they both loved. Then came that terrible day 3 years ago when Rebecca had gone hiking alone to photograph the autumn aspens. She'd fallen from a cliff while trying to get the perfect shot, and by the time Jake found her it was too late. The town said he'd carried her body down the mountain in his arms, and afterward, something inside him had simply broken. He'd resigned from search and rescue, sold their house in town and disappeared into the wilderness like a wounded animal seeking solitude. Elena understood that kind of pain, though her losses had been different. The slow death of a marriage, the betrayal of trust, the humiliation of being left with nothing while the man who'd promised to love her forever started a new life with someone else. She recognized the look in Jake Thompson's eyes because she saw it in her own mirror sometimes, the expression of someone who'd learned not to expect kindness from the world. The wind picked up outside, rattling the windows and reminding Elena that winter was coming whether she was ready or not. Pine Ridge's winters were legendary for their severity, and she had no idea how she was going to heat their little house through the long months ahead. The landlord had made it clear that he wasn't interested in payment plans or sob stories. He wanted his money, or he wanted them gone. Sofia looked up from her homework, her dark eyes serious beyond her 9 years. "Mama, why did that man put the paper on our door?" Elena forced a smile, not wanting to burden her daughter with adult worries. "It's just some boring grown-up stuff, sweetheart. Don't worry about it." But Sofia was too smart to be fooled by reassuring words, and Elena could see the understanding in her expression that their precarious situation had gotten worse. Tommy abandoned his toy cars and climbed into Elena's lap, his small body seeking warmth and comfort. At 7, he still believed his mother could fix anything, and Elena wrapped her arms around him while silently praying she wouldn't disappoint that faith. "Are we going to have to move again, Mama?" he asked in a whisper, and Elena's heart broke a little more. These children had already been through too much upheaval in their young lives. "I'm going to figure something out," Elena promised, though she had no idea what that something might be. She'd already asked everyone in town for extra work. She'd applied for assistance programs and been told there were waiting.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now, back to the story.
Lists. She'd even swallowed her pride and tried to contact her ex-husband, only to discover he'd changed his phone number and left no forwarding address. The approaching storm was already making itself known through the dropping temperature and the way the wind moaned through the mountain passes. Elena had learned to read Montana weather during her 2 years in Pine Ridge, and all the signs pointed to the season's first serious blizzard. The kind that could dump 3 feet of snow in a matter of hours and leave the town cut off from the outside world for days. The kind that killed people who weren't prepared. As she tucked her children into bed that night, Elena made a decision that would change everything. She would drive to the county seat first thing in the morning and apply for every job, every assistance program, every opportunity she could find. The round trip would use the last of her gas money, but desperation left no room for caution. She kissed Sofia and Tommy goodnight, promising them everything would be better soon, hoping it wasn't a lie. What Elena couldn't know as she finally fell into exhausted sleep was that Jake Thompson was having the worst kind of dreams again, the ones where Rebecca's voice called to him from the mountain peaks, asking why he hadn't been there to save her. What she couldn't know was that tomorrow's drive would take her directly through Jake's domain, along the old mining road that wound through the most remote and dangerous part of the mountain range. And what neither of them could know was that the storm building strength in the western peaks would arrive 12 hours ahead of schedule, turning Elena's desperate journey into a life-or-death situation that would force the mountain man who'd sworn off human connection to make a choice that would define them both. The mountains that had taken so much from Jake Thompson were about to give him something back, though the price of that gift would test every wall he'd built around his wounded heart. The last thing Elena saw before sleep claimed her was the eviction notice on her kitchen counter, its deadline looming like a death sentence. The last thing Jake saw from his cabin window was the approaching storm clouds, dark and heavy with the promise of the kind of weather that separated the survivors from the lost. Neither of them realized they were both about to discover that sometimes salvation comes in the form of the very thing you've been running from, and sometimes the gentleness you thought was gone forever was just waiting for the right moment to return. Dawn broke gray and threatening over Pine Ridge, with clouds hanging so low they seemed to brush the rooftops of the small mountain town. Elena woke to the sound of sleet tapping against her bedroom window like skeletal fingers, and her stomach immediately clenched with anxiety. The weather was deteriorating faster than predicted, but she couldn't afford to postpone her desperate trip to the county seat. Every day that passed brought her closer to homelessness, and with winter bearing down on them like a freight train, time had become her enemy. She dressed quietly in the pre-dawn darkness, pulling on her warmest clothes and checking her purse for the thin stack of documents she'd gathered, employment applications, assistance forms, and the eviction notice that served as proof of her dire circumstances. The gas gauge in her 15-year-old Honda showed just under a quarter tank, barely enough for the round trip if she was careful. Elena had calculated the distance 3 times, measuring it against her dwindling resources, like a general planning a crucial battle. Sofia stirred as Elena tiptoed through their shared bedroom, her daughter's eyes opening with the instant alertness of a child who'd learned to worry about adult problems. "Where are you going, Mama?" she whispered, careful not to wake Tommy, who was curled up in the small bed across the room, his breathing deep and even in the way that only children could sleep despite uncertainty. "I have some important errands to run in the county seat," Elena whispered back, smoothing Sofia's dark hair away from her face. "Mrs. Santos will check on you and Tommy while I'm gone, okay? I should be back before dinner." The lie came easily because the alternative, explaining that their entire future depended on this desperate gamble, would only frighten her daughter more. Sofia nodded solemnly, but Elena could see the questions in her eyes, the worry that seemed far too mature for a 9-year-old face. "Be careful driving, Mama. The roads get scary when it's icy." Elena's heart squeezed at the adult concern in her little girl's voice, another reminder of how much her children had been forced to grow up since their father abandoned them. The Honda's engine turned over reluctantly in the cold, coughing and sputtering before finally catching with a sound that didn't inspire confidence. Elena let it warm up for a few precious minutes, watching her breath fog in the freezing air while she scraped ice from the windshield with a plastic scraper that had seen better days. The heater barely worked, and she knew the long drive ahead would be uncomfortable at best, dangerous at worst. Pine Ridge's main street was deserted at this early hour, with most of the shops still dark, and the diner not yet open for business. Elena drove slowly through town, passing the post office where notices of winter road closures were already posted, past the small grocery store where she'd soon be unable to afford even the basics, past the church where she'd been attending services in hopes of finding some kind of spiritual comfort in her trials. The road out of town began climbing immediately into the foothills, winding through stands of pine and aspen trees, whose branches were heavy with the first snow of the season. Elena had driven this route only once before, when she'd first come to Pine Ridge, looking for a fresh start, but that had been during a beautiful summer day when the mountains looked welcoming rather than threatening. Now, with storm clouds gathering and the temperature dropping, the peaks loomed over her like ancient guardians protecting secrets she had no right to discover. 20 miles out of Pine Ridge, the pavement gave way to gravel on the old mining road, a treacherous stretch that wound through some of the most remote terrain in Montana. This shortcut through the mountains would save her 30 miles in precious gasoline, but it also meant traveling through areas where cell phone service was non-existent, and help could be hours away. Elena gripped the steering wheel tighter as the Honda bounced over ruts and potholes, her anxiety mounting with every mile that took her further from civilization. The storm that had been threatening all morning finally began in earnest as Elena reached the highest point of her journey, a narrow pass between 2 towering peaks that the locals called Devil's Backbone. Snow began falling in thick heavy flakes that quickly covered her windshield faster than the wipers could clear them. The temperature gauge on her dashboard crept upward into the red zone, and she realized with growing panic that the old Honda wasn't handling the combination of altitude, cold and strain. Elena pressed on because turning back wasn't an option, not when her children's future hung in the balance. The county offices would be closing at 5 o'clock, and she needed every possible minute to complete her applications and plead her case to anyone who would listen. But as the snow fell harder and the road became increasingly treacherous, she began to understand that she'd made a terrible miscalculation. The Honda finally gave up with a shudder and a grinding noise that spoke of terminal mechanical failure just as Elena rounded a curve that offered a spectacular view of the valley below. Steam poured from under the hood, and the engine died with a final wheeze that left her coasting to a stop beside a small grove of pine trees. The silence that followed was absolute, except for the whisper of falling snow and the tick of cooling metal. Elena turned the key repeatedly, but the engine wouldn't even turn over. She was stranded in one of the most remote areas of the Montana mountains with a storm that was rapidly becoming a blizzard, no cell phone service, and no hope of rescue from the few vehicles that might use this isolated road. Panic rose in her throat like bile as she realized the full scope of her situation. She climbed out of the car to assess the damage, immediately sinking ankle-deep in snow that was falling faster than seemed possible. The hood was too hot to touch, but steam and the smell of burning oil told her everything she needed to know. The Honda wasn't going anywhere under its own power, and she was at least 15 miles from the nearest town in either direction. Elena got back in the car and tried her cell phone even though she knew it was useless in this area. No signal as expected. The gas gauge showed nearly empty, which meant she couldn't even run the engine intermittently for heat assuming it would start. The temperature was dropping rapidly, and she had maybe 3 hours of daylight left before full darkness made her situation even more desperate. For the first time since leaving Los Angeles, Elena allowed herself to truly despair. She thought of Sofia and Tommy waiting at home depending on her to somehow solve their problems, and the knowledge that she might have orphaned them with her desperate gamble made her physically sick. Mrs. Santos would check on them as promised, but what would happen when Elena didn't return? How long would it take for anyone to realize she was missing? And by then would it be too late? The snow was accumulating with frightening speed, already covering the Honda's windows and beginning to muffle the familiar sounds of the world. Elena had heard stories of people found frozen in their cars after mountain blizzards, and she realized with crystalline clarity that she might be about to become one of those cautionary tales unless something miraculous happened. She wrapped herself in the thin emergency blanket she kept in the car and tried to conserve body heat while fighting off the panic that threatened to overwhelm rational thought. There had to be something she could do, some way to signal for help or find shelter. But as the wind picked up and the snow began to drift against her car, Elena faced the terrifying possibility that her desperate attempt to save her family might instead destroy them all. Jake Thompson felt the storm in his bones before the first flakes began to fall, the way Rebecca used to feel changes in the weather through some intuitive connection to the natural world. He stood on the covered porch of his remote cabin, watching the sky darken with the particular malevolence that preceded a serious mountain blizzard, and wondered if he should make the long trek down to Pine Ridge to stock up on supplies before the roads became impassable. 3 years of isolation had taught him to read every nuance of the weather patterns that dominated this high mountain valley. The wind direction, the color of the clouds, the way his old injuries ached, all of it told him this storm would be worse than the weather service predicted. The kind of storm that cut power lines, blocked roads for days, and killed people who weren't prepared for its fury. Jake's cabin sat on a natural shelf of rock nearly 1,500 feet above the valley floor, accessible only by a narrow dirt track that he maintained himself with a bulldozer blade mounted on his pickup truck. The location offered complete privacy and spectacular views, but it also meant that once the snow started falling in earnest, he would be completely cut off from the outside world until spring. That isolation had been exactly what he wanted when he built this place, but today something felt different, as if the mountains themselves were trying to tell him something important. He moved through his morning routine with the mechanical precision that had kept him functional since Rebecca's death. Coffee brewed from beans he ordered online and had delivered to the post office in Pine Ridge. Breakfast of eggs from his small flock of chickens and bacon from the wild pig he'd taken the previous autumn. Firewood split and stacked with the methodical rhythm that quieted his thoughts and kept memories at bay. But today the routine felt hollow, incomplete in a way that made him restless. Jake found himself walking from room to room in the log cabin he'd built with his own hands, looking for some task that might occupy his mind and explain the strange unease that had settled over him like morning fog. The cabin was designed for one person living simply, a large main room with kitchen, dining and sitting areas, a master bedroom where he slept alone on a king-size bed that felt enormous in its emptiness, and a smaller room that he'd originally planned as a nursery but now used for storage. Rebecca's presence still lingered in every corner despite his efforts to pack away her belongings. Her camera equipment sat on a shelf in the storage room, too precious to discard but too painful to look at regularly. Her books filled the shelves in the main room, their margins filled with her neat handwriting and thoughtful observations about everything from poetry to wilderness survival. Her easel stood in the corner where the morning light had been best, still holding the unfinished watercolor painting she'd been working on the day she died. Jake had learned to live with ghosts, but on mornings like this when the weather was about to turn dangerous, he found himself remembering Rebecca's voice urging him to check on their neighbors before storms hit. She'd always worried about the elderly folks who lived alone in the mountains, the families who might not be prepared for extended isolation, the travelers who might be caught unprepared by rapidly changing conditions. Someone needs to be watching out for people, she'd said during their last conversation, the morning she'd left with her camera to capture what she called the perfect autumn light. You can't save everyone, Jake, but that doesn't mean you stop trying to save the ones you can. Those words had haunted him for 3 years, a reminder of the man he'd been before grief turned him into something harder and more selfish. Jake walked to the window that faced down the mountain toward the old mining road, a route that foolish travelers sometimes used as a shortcut without understanding its dangers. The road was barely maintained, subject to rock slides and washouts, with no cell phone coverage and precious few places to turn around if conditions became impassable. During his years with search and rescue, Jake had pulled more than a dozen people off that road, usually city folks who'd underestimated the mountains and nearly paid for their mistake with their lives. The snow was falling harder now, thick flakes that meant business rather than the light dustings that sometimes teased the high country in early autumn. Jake's weather radio crackled to life with updated forecasts that confirmed his instincts. The storm was intensifying faster than predicted, with snow accumulations expected to exceed 3 feet in the higher elevations. Blizzard warnings were being issued for the entire region, with authorities urging people to avoid unnecessary travel. Something made Jake grab his binoculars and scan the visible sections of the old mining road far below. Maybe it was Rebecca's voice in his memory, or maybe it was the restlessness that had been building all morning, but he felt compelled to check for any travelers who might be caught in increasingly dangerous conditions. The road was mostly hidden by trees and terrain, but there were a few spots where it emerged into view for someone who knew where to look. At first he saw nothing but snow and forest, the familiar landscape transformed by the steadily falling precipitation, but as he adjusted the focus and methodically scanned each visible section of roadway, a flash of color caught his attention. There, nearly 5 miles away at the highest point of the pass, something dark red was partially visible through the swirling snow. Jake adjusted the binoculars, and felt his chest tighten with recognition and dread. A vehicle was stopped beside the road in an area where no one would stop voluntarily, especially not in this weather. Even from this distance, Jake could see snow accumulating on the car's roof and hood, indicating it had been stationary for some time. Steam or vapor was visible around the front of the vehicle, suggesting mechanical failure rather than a planned stop. For 3 years Jake had managed to ignore the outside world and the people in it, convincing himself that he'd done enough saving for one lifetime, and that his obligation to help others had died with Rebecca. But as he watched snow beginning to drift around the stranded vehicle, he felt something crack inside the wall of indifference he'd built around his heart. Someone was in serious trouble down there, and if the storm continued to intensify as predicted, they might not survive the night. Jake set down the binoculars and walked to his gun cabinet, not because he expected danger but because mountain rescues sometimes required protection from wildlife or other hazards. His service pistol felt familiar in his hand, a tool he'd carried for years during search and rescue operations. He strapped on the shoulder holster and began gathering the equipment he'd need for what might be a very difficult retrieval operation. His rescue pack had been hanging unused in the closet for 3 years, but Jake's hands remembered the routine of checking each piece of equipment: medical supplies, emergency shelter, extra clothing, high-energy food, water purification tablets, signaling devices and climbing gear in case the terrain demanded it. The pack was heavier than he remembered, or maybe 3 years of solitude had made him soft, despite the physical work of maintaining his mountain homestead. The pickup truck started reluctantly in the cold, but the engine smoothed out as it warmed up. Jake had modified the vehicle extensively for mountain conditions: oversized tires with aggressive tread, a powerful winch mounted on the front bumper, extra ground clearance, and a reinforced suspension that could handle the worst terrain the mountains could offer. The truck bed was loaded with chains, tow straps, shovels and other emergency equipment that he'd accumulated during his years of pulling people out of trouble. As Jake began the treacherous descent toward the old mining road, he found himself wondering what kind of fool would be traveling this route in deteriorating weather conditions. Probably some tourist who'd underestimated the mountains, and was about to learn a harsh lesson about respecting forces beyond human control. He'd rescued plenty of people just like that over the years, overconfident city dwellers who thought four-wheel drive and good intentions were sufficient preparation for wilderness travel. But as the snow fell harder and the wind began to howl through the mountain passes, Jake felt a familiar urgency building in his chest, the same feeling that had driven him to risk his own life repeatedly to save strangers who'd made poor choices. It was a compulsion he'd thought was buried with Rebecca, but apparently some instincts ran too deep to kill completely. The road down the mountain was becoming treacherous even for Jake's modified truck, and he realized that whoever was stranded up ahead would have no chance of getting out under their own power. This was going to be a rescue operation whether he wanted it to be or not, and for the first time in 3 years, Jake Thompson was about to come face to face with someone who needed the man he used to be rather than the hermit he'd become. Elena watched the snow accumulate on her windshield with growing desperation, each flake that stuck and didn't melt representing another degree of temperature drop and another step closer to a situation from which there might be no return. The Honda had been silent for over an hour, and the interior temperature was dropping rapidly despite her efforts to conserve body heat by wrapping herself in the emergency blanket and keeping moving as much as possible in the confined space. She'd tried starting the engine every 15 minutes, hoping against hope that cooling might somehow restore it to life, but each attempt resulted in nothing but the clicking of a starter that was trying to engage with something that simply wouldn't respond. The battery was getting weaker with each failed attempt, and Elena realized she was probably making her situation worse by draining the electrical system. The smart thing would be to conserve the battery power for the hazard lights, which might make her visible to any rescue vehicle that happened to come along this remote road. But as the hours passed and the snow continued to fall with no sign of letting up, Elena began to understand that the chances of another vehicle using this route during a blizzard were essentially non-existent. She'd found a small flashlight in the glove compartment, but the batteries were weak and she knew she needed to use it sparingly. The thin beam revealed that snow was already beginning to drift against the passenger side of the car, and she could hear the wind picking up outside with a sound like voices calling across vast distances. Every mountain story she'd ever heard about people found frozen in their vehicles came flooding back with terrifying clarity. Elena tried to stay calm by focusing on her children, imagining Sofia helping Tommy with his homework while Mrs. Santos kept watch from next door. They would be safe and warm, probably not even worried yet about their mother's delayed return. But as afternoon faded toward evening and the storm showed no signs of weakening, Elena began to face the possibility that Sofia and Tommy might become orphans because of her desperate gamble to save their home. The irony was bitter. In trying to prevent her children from becoming homeless, she might have made them motherless instead. Elena had risked everything on this trip to the county seat, and now it appeared she was going to lose not just the gamble but her life as well. The thought of her children waiting for her to come home, perhaps looking out the window for headlights that would never appear, made her physically sick with grief and self-recrimination. She tried to distract herself by rationing the small bottle of water she'd brought and the granola bar that represented her lunch, but even those simple tasks reminded her of how completely unprepared she'd been for this disaster. Elena had been so focused on the financial emergency that she'd ignored the weather warnings, so desperate to solve their housing crisis that she'd taken foolish risks that might cost her everything. As darkness began to fall and the temperature continued to drop, Elena heard a sound that made her heart race with a mixture of hope and terror. Through the howling wind and muffled acoustics of the storm, she could make out the distant rumble of a powerful engine working hard against difficult conditions. The sound grew louder gradually, suggesting a vehicle approaching from the direction of Pine Ridge, traveling slowly and deliberately through increasingly hazardous conditions. Elena fumbled for the flashlight and began signaling frantically, waving the weak beam back and forth in what she hoped would be visible through the falling snow. She tried honking the Honda's horn, but the electrical system was too weak to produce more than a pathetic bleat that wouldn't carry far in the storm conditions. All she could do was keep signaling with the flashlight and pray that whoever was out there in this weather would see her distress and be willing to help rather than just drive past. The engine sound grew louder and more distinct, revealing itself to be a large truck with a powerful motor, exactly the kind of vehicle that might have a chance of navigating these conditions successfully. Elena's heart hammered with desperate hope as headlights appeared through the swirling snow, approaching her location with the careful pace of someone who understood mountain driving in winter conditions. The truck that emerged from the storm was massive and obviously modified for extreme conditions, with oversized tires, a snowplow blade on the front, and enough ground clearance to handle terrain that would stop most vehicles. As it pulled up beside her stranded Honda, Elena could see the silhouette of a single occupant in the cab, someone large and broad-shouldered who moved with the controlled precision of someone accustomed to handling emergencies. Elena rolled down her window despite the cold air that immediately flooded into the car, desperate to communicate with her potential rescuer before he might decide the situation was too dangerous and drive away. "Help me please," she called out, her voice cracking with emotion and cold. "My car broke down and I'm stuck." The truck's driver's side door opened and a man emerged who seemed to fill the space around him with presence and capability. Even in the dim light and swirling snow, Elena could see that he was tall and powerfully built, moving with the kind of confidence that came from years of dealing with mountain emergencies. He wore heavy winter gear that looked professional rather than recreational, and he approached her vehicle with the quick, efficient gait of someone who understood that time was critical in survival situations. "Ma'am, I'm Jake Thompson," the man said as he reached her window, his voice deep and steady despite the howling wind. "I saw your car from up the mountain and came down to check on you. Are you injured?" Up close, Elena could see intelligent gray eyes and a face that was weathered by sun and wind, framed by dark hair and a beard that suggested someone who lived outside normal society's expectations. "I'm not hurt, just cold and scared," Elena replied, surprised by how steady her own voice sounded now that help had arrived. "My engine overheated and died, and I don't have any cell phone service to call for help. I've been stuck here for hours." She could see Jake's eyes quickly assessing her condition, and the situation with the professional competence of someone who'd done this kind of thing many times before. "The storm's getting worse fast," Jake said, glancing at the snow that was now falling so thickly it was hard to see more than a few yards in any direction. "We need to get you out of here right now. Do you have any medical conditions I should know about? Any medications you need?" His questions were direct and practical, focused on the immediate necessities of keeping her alive rather than small talk or explanations that could wait until they were both safe. Elena shook her head, though she was beginning to shiver more violently as the adrenaline of rescue began to mix with the delayed reaction of how close she'd come to serious trouble. "I'm basically healthy, just cold, but I have 2 children at home in Pine Ridge who are expecting me back tonight. They'll be worried sick if I don't show up." The mention of her children seemed to register with Jake in a way that added urgency to his already efficient movements. "We'll get word to them that you're safe," Jake promised as he opened her car door and helped her out into the storm. "Right now we need to focus on getting you somewhere warm before this weather gets any worse. Can you walk okay?" Elena nodded and took a step, immediately sinking knee-deep in snow that was much deeper than it had appeared from inside the car. Jake steadied her with a strong hand on her elbow, his grip firm but gentle in a way that suggested someone accustomed to helping people in distress. "Take my arm and stay close," he said, guiding her toward his truck through snow that was falling so heavily it was like walking through a white curtain. "The footing's tricky and we don't want you taking a fall out here." Elena felt a surge of gratitude so intense it brought tears to her eyes as Jake helped her into the passenger seat of his truck. The interior was warm and spacious with the kind of professional emergency equipment that suggested this wasn't his first mountain rescue. As he climbed into the driver's seat and began the careful process of turning the large vehicle around on the narrow road, Elena realized she was in the hands of someone who actually knew what he was doing in conditions like this. "Thank you," she said quietly as Jake expertly maneuvered the truck through a 3-point turn that avoided the drainage ditches on both sides of the road. "I was starting to think I might not make it out of there alive." Jake glanced at her briefly, and Elena caught something in his expression that suggested her gratitude made him uncomfortable rather than pleased. "Just doing what anyone would do," he replied gruffly, focusing on his driving as they began the slow journey back toward civilization. But Elena had heard enough stories about Jake Thompson to know that wasn't true. He'd been living as a hermit for 3 years, avoiding human contact and refusing to get involved in other people's problems. Whatever had motivated him to come down from his mountain refuge to help a stranger, it wasn't something he did lightly or often. As the truck's powerful engine pulled them steadily through conditions that would have been impossible for most vehicles, Elena found herself studying her rescuer's profile in the dashboard lights. Jake Thompson had the kind of face that suggested someone who'd seen more than his share of life's hardships, but there was also a fundamental decency in his features that explained why he'd risked his own safety to help a stranger in trouble. She was looking at a man who'd been shaped by loss but hadn't let it destroy the essential goodness that drove him to save people even when he was trying to avoid them. "Where are we going?" Elena asked as they moved slowly but steadily through the storm, the truck's headlights creating a small bubble of visibility in the surrounding whiteness. "My place," Jake replied simply. "It's closer than Pine Ridge and better equipped to handle weather like this. You'll be safe there until the storm passes and we can figure out what to do about your car." Elena nodded, understanding that she was placing her trust in a man she'd never actually met, but feeling instinctively that Jake Thompson was exactly the kind of person who could be trusted with someone's life. As they climbed higher into the mountains through conditions that seemed to be worsening by the minute, Elena realized that her desperate gamble to save her family's future had led her into an encounter that might change everything in ways she couldn't yet imagine. The mountain man who'd rescued her from certain death was carrying his own burdens, and somehow their meeting in the midst of this storm felt like more than just coincidence. It felt like the beginning of something neither of them had been looking for but both of them desperately needed. Jake's cabin materialized out of the storm like something from a dream, its warm golden windows glowing against the white darkness that surrounded them. Elena had never been so grateful to see electric lights in her life, and as Jake's truck crunched to a stop beside the covered porch, she felt tears of relief freezing on her cheeks. The structure was larger than she'd expected, built from massive logs that spoke of permanence and craftsmanship, with a metal roof designed to shed heavy snow loads and solar panels that suggested someone who valued self-sufficiency above convenience. "Welcome to my home," Jake said quietly as he helped her down from the truck's high cab, his hand steady on her arm as she navigated steps that were slippery with accumulated snow. The wind howled around them with a fury that seemed personal, as if the storm was angry at being denied a victim, but the cabin's solid walls promised sanctuary from forces beyond human control. Inside, the warmth hit Elena like a physical embrace. A massive stone fireplace dominated one wall of the main room, its flames casting dancing shadows across hand-hewn beams and rustic furniture that looked both comfortable and built to last. The space was larger than her entire rental house, with high ceilings that gave it an almost cathedral-like feeling of peace and shelter. But what struck Elena most forcefully was how clean and organized everything appeared, as if Jake maintained military precision in his domestic arrangements despite living alone in the wilderness. "Sit by the fire and get warm," Jake instructed, shrugging out of his heavy winter coat and hanging it on a peg beside the door. "I'll put some coffee on and see about getting word to your children that you're safe." Elena sank into a leather armchair that felt like it had been designed for someone much larger than herself, grateful for the heat that immediately began penetrating her chilled body. Jake moved around his kitchen with efficient purpose, starting coffee in a machine that looked commercial-grade and checking what appeared to be a two-way radio system mounted on one wall. "Jake Thompson calling Pine Ridge Base, over," he said into the microphone, his voice carrying the authority of someone accustomed to emergency communications. After a moment, a crackling voice responded with obvious relief. "Jake, this is Sheriff Morrison at the Pine Ridge Station. Good to hear from you, son. We've got reports of several stranded vehicles and we're starting to worry about search and rescue operations. What's your status?" Elena perked up at the familiar name, recognizing the sheriff as someone she'd seen occasionally at the diner where she worked. "I've got a stranded motorist here at my place, Elena Rodriguez from town. Her car broke down on the old mining road and she's got 2 kids at home who need to know she's safe. Can you get word to them?" Jake's request was direct and professional, the tone of someone who'd coordinated with law enforcement many times before. "Elena Rodriguez, the waitress from Murphy's Diner. Hell yes, I'll get word to her kids right away. Her neighbor Mrs. Santos has been calling the station every hour asking if we'd heard anything. Is Elena all right?" The genuine concern in the sheriff's voice made Elena's heart clench with gratitude for the close-knit community she'd found in Pine Ridge. "She's cold and shaken but uninjured. I'll keep her here until the storm passes and the roads are safe for travel, probably looking at 2 or 3 days minimum given what the weather service is predicting." Jake glanced at Elena as he spoke, and she nodded her agreement with the plan, understanding that she had no choice but to accept his hospitality. "You tell Elena that her kids are fine and not to worry about anything. Mrs. Santos is with them and half the town is keeping an eye on that little family. We'll have her car towed once the weather clears. Jake, it's good to know you're still up there watching out for folks. Rebecca would be proud." The radio fell silent after that last comment, and Elena saw something pass across Jake's features like a shadow of old pain. Jake set down the radio microphone without responding to the sheriff's final comment, busying himself with coffee preparations while Elena wondered about the Rebecca who would apparently be proud of his rescue work. The kitchen area was immaculate and well-equipped, with high-end appliances that suggested someone who took cooking seriously despite living alone. Everything spoke of careful thought and substantial investment, as if Jake had built this place to last for decades rather than just provide temporary shelter. "Thank you for getting word to Sofia and Tommy," Elena said gratefully as Jake brought her a mug of coffee that smelled better than anything she'd had in months. "They're only 9 and 7 and they worry about me when I'm late. They've been through enough upheaval in their young lives." The coffee was rich and perfectly brewed, warming her from the inside as the fire warmed her externally. "Kids that age shouldn't have to worry about adult problems," Jake replied, settling into another chair across from her with his own coffee mug. "But sometimes life doesn't give us much choice in the matter." His voice carried a weight of personal experience that made Elena wonder what struggles had shaped his perspective on childhood and loss. Elena found herself studying Jake more carefully now that they were in good light and out of immediate danger. He was probably in his mid-40s, with the kind of rugged handsomeness that came from years of outdoor work and mountain living. His dark hair showed threads of silver, and lines around his gray eyes suggested someone who'd spent considerable time squinting into sun and wind. But there was also something guarded about his expression, as if he was accustomed to keeping people at a careful distance. "I don't know how to thank you for what you did today," Elena said, wrapping her hands around the warm coffee mug. "If you hadn't come along when you did, I honestly don't think I would have survived the night. My children would have become orphans because I made a stupid decision to travel in dangerous weather." The words brought tears to her eyes, as she fully processed how close she'd come to disaster. Jake was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire with an expression that suggested he was wrestling with thoughts he didn't often share. "I lost someone I loved because I wasn't there when she needed me," he finally said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I swore I'd never let that happen to anyone else if I could prevent it. Your kids need their mother, and today I was in a position to make sure they didn't lose her." The raw pain in Jake's voice made Elena's heart ache for him. She remembered the stories she'd heard around town about his wife's death, the hiking accident that had apparently destroyed his faith in life's basic fairness. "The radio mentioned someone named Rebecca," she said gently. "Was she your wife?" Jake nodded without looking at her, his jaw tightening in a way that suggested this was territory he rarely allowed anyone to explore. "Rebecca was my everything. We'd been married 8 years, planning to start a family, building this place together as our refuge from the world. She was a photographer, always chasing perfect light and amazing shots. One day she went out alone to photograph the autumn aspens, and she never came home." Elena felt tears welling up for this man's loss, understanding now why he'd become a hermit, and why helping her had cost him something emotionally. "I'm so sorry, Jake. Losing someone you love that way must be unbearable." She wanted to reach out and comfort him somehow, but something in his posture warned her that sympathy might not be welcome. "The worst part is that it was preventable," Jake continued, still staring into the flames as if they held answers to questions he'd been asking for 3 years. "Rebecca was an experienced hiker, but she went alone to a dangerous area because she was trying to surprise me with photographs for our anniversary. If I'd gone with her, if I'd insisted on safety protocols, if I'd paid more attention to the weather conditions that day, she'd still be alive." Elena recognized the self-blame and survivor's guilt in Jake's words because she'd wrestled with similar demons after her marriage fell apart. "Sometimes terrible things happen despite our best efforts to prevent them," she said softly. "You can't blame yourself for not being psychic about dangers you couldn't have predicted." "Everyone says that," Jake replied with a bitter smile, "but saying it doesn't make the guilt go away. Rebecca died because I failed to protect her, and I've been living with that knowledge every day since. Coming down that mountain today to help you was the first time I've involved myself in anyone else's problems since her funeral." Elena felt honored and humbled that her crisis had somehow penetrated the wall of isolation Jake had built around himself. "Then I'm even more grateful that you made that choice. My children and I will never forget what you did for us today." She paused, studying his profile in the firelight. "But I have to ask, what made you decide to help me? According to what I've heard in town, you've been avoiding people for 3 years. Jake was quiet for so long that Elena thought he might not answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a vulnerability that suggested he was revealing something he'd barely admitted to himself. "I was watching the storm through binoculars, checking the roads like Rebecca used to make me do when bad weather was coming. She always worried about travelers who might be caught unprepared. When I saw your car stopped in that dangerous area, I heard her voice in my head telling me that someone needed help." The admission hung in the air between them like a bridge neither had expected to build. Elena understood that Jake had just shared something deeply personal, a connection to his deceased wife that had motivated him to rejoin the human race, at least temporarily. "She sounds like she was a wonderful person," Elena said gently. "She was the best person I've ever known," Jake replied, finally looking directly at Elena for the first time since they'd started talking about Rebecca. "She saw good in everyone, believed that kindness was the most important thing a person could offer the world. She would have liked you, I think. She always had a soft spot for mothers trying to raise children on their own." Elena felt a warm glow at the compliment, even though it came from someone she'd never met. "What was she like? I mean, if you don't mind talking about her." She could see Jake weighing whether to continue the conversation or retreat back into the safer territory of practical concerns. "Rebecca had this way of making ordinary moments feel magical," Jake said, a genuine smile softening his features for the first time since Elena had met him. "She could find beauty in things other people would walk right past, the way morning light hit a spider web, the pattern frost made on windows, the sound wind made in different types of trees. She taught me to see the world through her eyes, and after she died, everything just looked gray and empty." Elena could hear the love in Jake's voice when he talked about his wife, and she understood why losing her had been devastating enough to drive him into complete isolation. It sounds like you had something very special together. That kind of love is rare and precious, even when it ends too soon. She thought of her own failed marriage and the way her ex-husband had simply walked away from their family without looking back. We did have something special, Jake agreed. But special doesn't make it hurt less when it's gone. Some days I think the pain of missing her is going to kill me, and other days I'm afraid it won't. His honesty was brutal and beautiful at the same time, the kind of raw truth that people rarely shared with strangers. Elena felt compelled to offer something equally honest in return.
I understand loneliness, though my situation is different from yours.
My husband left me and the children 2 years ago for another woman. One day he was part of our family, and the next day he was gone like he'd never existed. The kids still ask when Daddy is coming home, and I have to keep making excuses because I don't know how to explain that some people just abandon the people who love them. Jake's expression darkened with something that might have been anger on her behalf. What kind of man walks away from his children? I'd give anything to have kids of my own, and he just threw that gift away like it meant nothing. The protective fury in his voice surprised Elena with its intensity. Some people don't appreciate what they have until it's gone, Elena replied sadly. And some people never appreciate it at all. My ex-husband always saw Sofia and Tommy as inconveniences that prevented him from living the life he wanted. When his secretary got pregnant, he decided that was his chance for a fresh start without the complications of an existing family. His loss, Jake said firmly. From what I could tell during the radio conversation, your children are well loved and your community cares about your family. That doesn't happen by accident. That happens because you're raising good kids and treating people right. Elena felt tears threatening again, this time from gratitude for Jake's unexpected validation. I try my best, but sometimes I feel like I'm failing them. We're about to be evicted from our house. I can barely afford groceries, and today I nearly orphaned them because I took a desperate risk to try to solve our problems. Some days I wonder if they'd be better off with someone who could actually provide for them properly. Don't you dare think that, Jake said with sudden fierce intensity. Those kids need their mother, not someone with more money. Love and stability matter more than bank account balances, and from what I can see you've got both of those things covered. His passionate defense of her parenting surprised Elena with its vehemence. Thank you for saying that, Elena whispered, wiping away tears that had escaped despite her efforts to maintain composure. Some days I need to hear that I'm doing something right, even if everything else is falling apart around us. Jake stood abruptly and walked to the kitchen, returning with a plate of sandwiches that he must have prepared while they were talking. You need to eat something. Stress and cold burn calories fast, and you've had plenty of both today. The sandwiches were substantial and well made with what appeared to be homemade bread and quality ingredients. Elena realized she was starving, having eaten nothing since early morning before beginning her ill-fated journey. This is delicious, she said after taking several grateful bites. You're quite a cook for someone who lives alone in the mountains. The bread was indeed homemade, dense and flavorful in the way that store-bought bread could never match. Rebecca taught me, Jake replied simply. She said a man should know how to feed himself properly, and after she died, cooking became one of the ways I remembered her. She had strong opinions about the importance of good food prepared with care. Elena could see that maintaining Rebecca's standards had become part of how Jake honored her memory. As they ate in comfortable silence, Elena found herself looking around Jake's cabin with growing appreciation for the life he'd built in this remote location. The furniture was clearly handcrafted, probably by Jake himself, and everything spoke of quality and attention to detail. Bookshelves lined one wall, filled with volumes on subjects ranging from wilderness survival to classical literature. Rebecca's influence was visible everywhere, from the carefully chosen color scheme to the artistic arrangement of natural objects like interesting stones and pieces of driftwood. You built all this yourself? Elena asked, gesturing at the impressive architecture surrounding them. Rebecca and I designed it together, but I did most of the construction, Jake confirmed. We wanted something that would be completely self-sufficient and able to handle whatever the mountains threw at it. Solar power, backup generator, well water, septic system, wood heat, everything we needed to be independent. There was pride in his voice when he talked about the cabin, the satisfaction of someone who'd created something lasting with his own hands. It's beautiful, Elena said sincerely. You can feel
the love that went into every detail. Rebecca must have been so happy here.
She could imagine the life they'd planned to build together in this mountain sanctuary, and her heart ached for the future that had been stolen from them. She was happy here, Jake agreed, his voice growing soft with memory. She used to say this place was our little piece of heaven on earth, a spot where we could be ourselves without worrying about what the rest of the world expected from us. She had her photography studio set up in the loft, and she'd spend hours up there editing pictures and planning her next shooting expeditions. Elena could see the loft Jake mentioned, accessible by a sturdy wooden staircase that led to what appeared to be a spacious second floor. "Do you ever go up there now?" she asked gently, sensing that Rebecca's studio might be another shrine to their lost love. Jake shook his head, his expression becoming guarded again. "I can't. Her equipment is still up there, along with all her photographs and the projects she was working on. I keep meaning to pack it all away, but every time I start up those stairs I end up turning back. It's like she's still up there working, and I don't want to disturb her." Elena understood that Jake had created a kind of museum to his wife, preserving their shared spaces exactly as they'd been when she was alive. "Grief has its own timeline," she said softly. "There's no right or wrong way to process losing someone you love that much. You'll know when you're ready to face those memories, and until then, it's okay to leave things as they are." "Everyone in town has opinions about how I should be handling Rebecca's death," Jake said with obvious frustration. "They think 3 years is long enough to grieve, that I should be dating again or at least socializing more. But they didn't lose the person who made their whole world make sense. They don't understand that some losses change you so fundamentally that going back to normal isn't possible." Elena nodded emphatically, understanding exactly what Jake meant. People mean well, but they can't comprehend the depth of certain kinds of loss unless they've experienced it themselves. The death of a spouse and the end of a marriage aren't the same thing, but both can leave you feeling like you don't know who you are anymore without that person in your life. "Exactly," Jake said, looking at Elena with something approaching relief. "You get it. Most people hear that I've been alone for 3 years and they think I'm wallowing in self-pity or being dramatic. But the truth is, I don't know how to be myself without Rebecca. She was part of every decision I made, every plan for the future, every daily routine. When she died, it was like losing half of my soul." Elena felt a deep connection to Jake's words, recognizing the same disorientation she'd experienced when her marriage collapsed. "After my husband left, I felt like I was playing a role I didn't understand. Single mother, abandoned wife, someone who had to make all the decisions alone. I'd gotten so used to being part of a couple that I'd forgotten how to be just myself." "But you figured it out," Jake observed. "You're raising 2 children on your own, working to support them, fighting to keep your family together. That takes incredible strength and courage." There was admiration in his voice that made Elena sit up a little straighter. "Some days I don't feel strong or courageous," Elena admitted. "Some days I feel like I'm barely holding on by my fingernails. Today was one of those days. I was so desperate to solve our housing crisis that I made dangerous choices that could have cost my children their mother. That's not strength, that's panic." "But you're here," Jake pointed out. "You survived a dangerous situation, you're taking care of yourself so you can get back to your kids, and you're not giving up despite all the challenges you're facing. That's exactly what strength looks like, even when it doesn't feel like it from the inside." Elena felt something warm and unfamiliar blooming in her chest at Jake's words, a sense of being truly seen and valued that she hadn't experienced in years. "Thank you for seeing me that way. Most of the time I feel like I'm failing at everything, as a mother, as a provider, as an adult who should have her life figured out by now. We're all just making it up as we go along," Jake said with a slight smile. "The difference between people who seem to have it all figured out and people like us is that we're honest about how hard it is. That honesty makes us better parents and better people, even when it makes us feel more vulnerable." As the evening wore on and the storm continued to rage outside, Elena found herself more comfortable than she'd been in months, perhaps years. Jake's cabin felt like a sanctuary, not just from the weather but from all the stress and worry that had been consuming her life. Here, surrounded by warmth and acceptance, she could simply be herself without constantly calculating how to stretch the next dollar or solve the next crisis. Jake proved to be an excellent host, preparing a dinner that was simple but delicious, and keeping their conversation flowing without ever pushing her to share more than she was comfortable revealing. He had the rare gift of being an exceptional listener, asking thoughtful questions and offering insights without judgment or unsolicited advice. Elena found herself talking about her children with more joy than worry for the first time in months, sharing funny stories about Sofia's artistic ambitions and Tommy's endless curiosity about how everything worked. "Sofia sounds like she has real talent," Jake said after Elena described some of her daughter's more ambitious art projects. Rebecca always said that creativity was the most important gift a person could have, because it meant you could always find beauty in the world, even when circumstances were difficult. Sofia definitely has Rebecca's way of seeing beauty in unexpected places, Elena agreed. Last week she spent an entire afternoon drawing pictures of the frost patterns on our windows because she said they looked like fairy cities. I was worried about the heating bill, but she saw magic. That's exactly the kind of thing Rebecca would have noticed, Jake said with a smile that was both happy and sad. She had this theory that children and artists were connected to something the rest of us lose as we get older, the ability to see wonder in ordinary things. She would have loved Sofia's fairy cities. Elena felt touched that Jake was sharing these memories of Rebecca with her, understanding that he was honoring his wife's memory by recognizing similar qualities in her daughter. Maybe Sofia gets to be the artist I never had the courage to become. I always wanted to paint, but practical concerns kept taking priority until I convinced myself I wasn't talented enough to bother trying. It's never too late to start, Jake said gently. Rebecca used to say that creativity wasn't about being good enough for other people to admire, it was about feeding something essential in your own soul. She kept some basic art supplies for beginners who wanted to try painting the mountain scenery. They're still here if you ever want to experiment. The offer was casual but meaningful, another small gesture that spoke to Jake's fundamental kindness despite his reputation for avoiding human contact. Elena filed the information away, touched that he would think to offer such a thing to someone he'd known for less than a day. As bedtime approached and Jake showed Elena to the guest room he'd prepared for her, she found herself reluctant to end their conversation. Talking with Jake had been the most genuine human connection she'd experienced since moving to Pine Ridge, and she was surprised by how much she was going to miss his company overnight. "Thank you again for everything," Elena said as Jake handed her extra blankets and showed her where the bathroom was located. "You've been incredibly kind to a complete stranger, and I want you to know how much that means to me and my children." "You're not a stranger anymore," Jake replied quietly. "You're someone who trusted me to keep you safe, and that makes you family as far as I'm concerned. Sleep well, Elena. Tomorrow we'll figure out next steps for getting you back to your children and dealing with your car situation." As Elena settled into the comfortable guest bed, and listened to the storm continuing to howl outside, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in the span of a single day. This morning she'd been a desperate woman making dangerous choices to save her family from eviction. Tonight she was safe and warm in the home of a man who'd shown her more genuine care and understanding than she'd received from anyone in years. But more than just gratitude was keeping her awake as she stared at the ceiling and processed everything Jake had shared with her. There was something developing between them that felt both wonderful and terrifying, a connection that went deeper than simple attraction or even friendship. Elena recognized the beginnings of something that could become love if both of them were brave enough to let it grow, but she also understood that Jake was still deeply grieving his wife, and she was still struggling to rebuild her life as a single mother. The timing was terrible and the circumstances complicated, but as Elena finally drifted off to sleep, she couldn't deny that Jake Thompson had awakened something in her heart that she'd thought was dead forever. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and difficult decisions, but for tonight she was exactly where she needed to be, safe in the care of a man who understood both strength and vulnerability, loss and hope, isolation and the deep human need for connection. Elena woke to the sound of voices downstairs, male voices speaking in low, urgent tones that immediately set her nerves on edge. Through the guest room window, she could see that the storm had passed during the night, leaving behind a crystalline world of pristine snow that sparkled in the morning sunlight. But the tension in those distant voices suggested that not everything had improved with the clearing weather. She dressed quickly in yesterday's clothes and made her way downstairs, where she found Jake standing by his radio equipment talking to someone whose voice carried the authority of law enforcement. Jake's expression was grim, his jaw set in a way that suggested he was receiving news he didn't want to hear. When he noticed Elena on the stairs, he held up a hand asking her to wait while he finished the conversation. "I understand, Sheriff Morrison. Yes, I'll let her know immediately. No, there's no danger here, but you're right to be concerned about the situation in town." Jake's responses were clipped and professional, but Elena could see the muscles in his shoulders tightening with each exchange. "We'll stay put until you give the all clear. Keep me posted on any developments." Jake clicked off the radio and turned to face Elena with an expression that mixed anger with something that might have been protective fury. "There's been a development overnight that changes our situation significantly. Sheriff Morrison has some information you need to hear, but first I want you to know that you and your children are safe. Whatever happens next, I won't let anyone hurt your family." Elena's stomach dropped with dread at Jake's ominous tone. What kind of development? What's happened to Sofia and Tommy? Her mind immediately went to the worst possible scenarios: accidents, illness or some other crisis that had befallen her children while she was trapped on the mountain. Your children are fine, Jake assured her quickly. They're safe with Mrs. Santos and half the town is keeping an eye on them. But there's been trouble with your landlord, and Sheriff Morrison thinks it's connected to why your car broke down in exactly the location where it did. Jake's words carried implications that Elena's exhausted mind struggled to process. I don't understand. My car broke down because the engine overheated. What could that possibly have to do with my landlord? Elena sank into the chair she'd occupied the night before, her legs suddenly unsteady as adrenaline flooded her system. Jake poured her a cup of coffee from the pot he'd apparently started early, his movements careful and deliberate as if he was buying time to choose his words. Frank Morrison isn't just the local sheriff, Elena. He's also the man who's been pressuring you to leave your rental house. Sheriff Morrison, that's his brother. Deputy Sheriff Morrison has been doing some investigating since last night, and what he's discovered isn't pretty. Elena felt the world tilt sideways as Jake's words sank in. Frank Morrison is my landlord. But that's impossible. I've been dealing with a property management company, Mountain View Rentals. I've never met the actual owner of the house. Her mind raced through every interaction she'd had with the rental company, every phone call and written notice, searching for clues she might have missed. Mountain View Rentals is a shell company owned by Frank Morrison, Jake explained gently. He's been buying up rental properties all over the valley, and using them to control who gets to live in Pine Ridge and who gets forced out. According to his brother, Frank has been specifically targeting single mothers and elderly residents, people he considers undesirable for the community image he wants to create. Elena felt sick as the implications of what Jake was telling her became clear. Are you saying he's been trying to evict me not because I'm behind on rent, but because he doesn't want my family living in his town? The cruelty of such calculated discrimination was almost too much to comprehend. That's exactly what I'm saying, Jake confirmed, his voice tight with controlled anger. But it gets worse. Deputy Morrison found evidence that Frank has been sabotaging vehicles belonging to people he wants gone. Your car didn't break down by accident, Elena. Someone tampered with your radiator hose so it would fail during your trip to the county seat. Elena stared at Jake in horror as the full scope of Frank Morrison's maliciousness became clear. He tried to kill me. If you hadn't come along when you did, I would have died on that mountain, and my children would have been left orphaned. All because he didn't want us living in his town. The coffee mug in her hands began to shake as rage and terror warred for dominance in her emotional landscape. Frank Morrison underestimated two things, Jake said grimly. He didn't know I was still keeping watch on that road, and he didn't know his own brother well enough to realize that Deputy Morrison would investigate suspicious coincidences. Frank thought your death would look like a tragic accident, another cautionary tale about city folks who didn't respect mountain weather. Elena set down her coffee before she could spill it, her hands trembling with fury at the calculated cruelty of Morrison's plan. What happens now? Can he be arrested for what he did? And what about my children? Are they really safe with him running around loose? The protective instincts that had driven every decision she'd made since becoming a mother flared to life with volcanic intensity. Deputy Morrison has applied for warrants based on the evidence he's gathered, and the state police are sending investigators to take over the case. Frank Morrison is about to discover that attempted murder carries serious consequences, especially when the victim is a single mother with 2 young children. Jake's voice carried grim satisfaction at the thought of Morrison facing justice. Elena felt a wave of relief so intense it made her dizzy. For 2 years she'd been struggling against what she thought was just bad luck and economic hardship, never realizing that someone was actively working to destroy her family's life. Thank God his brother is an honest man. If Deputy Morrison hadn't investigated, Frank would have gotten away with murder. The Morrison brothers couldn't be more different, Jake confirmed. Deputy Sheriff Morrison has been fighting corruption in this county for years, and his own brother being involved in criminal activity is going to hit him hard. But he's putting duty above family loyalty, which takes real courage. Elena stood and walked to the window that looked out over the valley below, processing this new information while trying to calm her racing heart. The morning sun was turning the snow-covered landscape into something that belonged on a postcard, beautiful and peaceful in a way that seemed to mock the ugly human drama playing out in the town below. There's something else, Jake said quietly from behind her, something that changes everything about your situation and your children's future. Elena turned to face him, seeing an expression on his face that she couldn't quite read, part hope, part uncertainty, part something that looked almost like fear. What do you mean? Elena asked, though something in Jake's tone suggested this news would be very different from the revelations about Frank Morrison's criminal activities. Jake walked to a desk in the corner of the room and returned with a manila folder that looked official and important. Deputy Morrison did some additional investigating into your background as part of the case against his brother. He discovered something that Mountain View Rentals apparently missed during their tenant screening process. Jake held out the folder with hands that weren't quite steady. Elena took the folder with growing confusion, opening it to find documents she didn't recognize, legal papers covered with official seals and signatures that meant nothing to her tired brain. I don't understand what I'm looking at. What is all this? Your great-aunt Margaret Chen left you a property in Pine Ridge when she died 18 months ago, Jake said gently. The will was probated, but the notification letters were sent to your old address in Los Angeles. Since you'd already moved to Montana by then, you never received them. The property has been sitting empty while the estate attorneys tried to locate you. Elena stared at the documents in disbelief, reading her own name over and over again in legal language that seemed too good to be true. I inherited property, but I never even met my great-aunt Margaret. My mother mentioned her a few times, but they weren't close and I thought she died years ago. According to the will, Margaret Chen specifically wanted the property to go to her great-niece Elena Rodriguez, noting that you were a single mother who deserved a fresh start somewhere safe for your children. She left detailed instructions that the house was to be given to you free and clear, with no mortgage or other encumbrances. Jake's voice carried wonder at the timing of this discovery. Elena felt tears streaming down her face as she processed what Jake was telling her. Are you saying I own a house in Pine Ridge? That my children and I aren't going to be homeless after all? The emotional whiplash of going from despair to hope was almost too much for her overwhelmed system to handle. You own more than just a house, Jake said softly. Margaret Chen was apparently quite wealthy from her late husband's business investments. According to these documents, she also left you a trust fund specifically designated for your children's education and your family's living expenses. Elena, you're not just avoiding homelessness, you're financially secure for the first time since your divorce. Elena sank back into her chair as the magnitude of this unexpected windfall hit her. For 2 years she'd been struggling to keep her family afloat, working double shifts and rationing groceries and lying awake nights worrying about bills she couldn't pay. Now, because of a great-aunt she'd never met, all of those worries were suddenly irrelevant. I can't believe this is real, Elena whispered, looking at the legal documents as if they might disappear if she blinked. Yesterday I was facing eviction and wondering how I was going to feed my children, and today you're telling me we own a house and have money for their college educations. It's like winning the lottery, except better because someone who shared my blood cared enough to make sure we were taken care of. Margaret Chen sounds like she was a remarkable woman, Jake agreed. The lawyers said her will included a personal letter for you explaining her reasons for the bequest. She apparently followed your situation from a distance after your mother died, and she wanted to make sure you had the security and opportunity she never had as a young woman. Elena wiped away tears that kept flowing despite her efforts to maintain composure. Where is this house? Do you know anything about the property she left me? Part of her was afraid to hope too much, worried that there might be some catch that would make this miracle evaporate. Jake's expression grew thoughtful, and Elena caught something in his eyes that suggested he knew more about this property than he was initially letting on. The house is about 2 miles from here up on the ridge that overlooks the valley. It's been empty for over a year, but Margaret kept it in excellent condition before her death. The attorneys have been maintaining the property while they searched for you. Elena felt her heart skip as she processed the implications of Jake's words. 2 miles from here? You mean the house is near your cabin? The possibility that her new home would be close to Jake's mountain sanctuary filled her with an emotion she didn't dare name yet. Close enough that we'd be neighbors, Jake confirmed, and Elena thought she detected a note of pleased anticipation in his voice. The house sits on about 20 acres of private land with amazing views and complete privacy. Margaret and her husband built it as their retirement retreat, so it's designed for comfortable year-round living in mountain conditions. Elena stood and walked to the window again, this time looking up toward the ridge Jake had mentioned, trying to imagine a future where she and her children could live in security and beauty instead of constantly worrying about survival. Can we see it? I mean, when the roads are safe for travel, could you show me the property? I was hoping you'd ask that, Jake replied with the first genuine smile Elena had seen from him since they'd met. I've been keeping an eye on the place during the winter months, making sure the pipes don't freeze and the roof isn't damaged by snow loads. I know every inch of that property, and I think you're going to love what Margaret left for your family." Elena felt a surge of gratitude so intense it was almost physically painful. Not just gratitude for her great-aunt's incredible generosity, but gratitude for the series of events that had brought her to this mountain, to this storm, and to Jake Thompson's unexpected kindness. "Do you think this is all connected somehow? Frank Morrison trying to drive me out of town, my car breaking down exactly where you would find me, and now discovering that I owned property here all along. I think some things are meant to happen," Jake said quietly. "Rebecca used to say that the universe had a way of putting people where they needed to be when they needed to be there. Maybe your great-aunt Margaret is still looking out for you, making sure you ended up in the right place at the right time." Elena felt a chill of recognition at Jake's words, remembering her own sense the night before that their meeting felt like more than coincidence. If that's true, then maybe Rebecca had something to do with you being on that road yesterday. Maybe she knew you were ready to start helping people again, and I was the person who needed help. Jake was quiet for a long moment, his expression growing thoughtful as he considered Elena's suggestion. "I hadn't thought about it that way, but you might be right. For 3 years I've been hiding up here convincing myself that I was done with rescue work and helping people. Then yesterday I felt this compulsion to check the roads, like someone was telling me that I needed to be watching." Elena walked back to where Jake stood, close enough to see the silver threads in his dark hair and the lines around his eyes that spoke of years spent outdoors in all kinds of weather. "Thank you for listening to that compulsion. Thank you for being the kind of man who would risk his own safety to help a stranger. My children are going to grow up with their mother because you chose to care about what happened to people. Thank you for trusting me to keep you safe," Jake replied, his voice rougher than usual with emotion. "Yesterday was the first day in 3 years that I felt like myself again, like the man Rebecca married instead of the broken hermit I've been since she died. Helping you reminded me that I'm still capable of being useful to other people." Elena felt drawn to Jake in a way that was both thrilling and terrifying, recognizing the depth of connection that was developing between them despite the short time they'd known each other. "What happens now? I mean, after we deal with Frank Morrison's criminal charges, and I get settled into my new house, will we still be neighbors, or will you decide that you prefer complete isolation after all?" Jake's eyes searched Elena's face as if he was looking for the answer to a question he was afraid to ask directly. "That depends on whether you think you could be comfortable having a neighbor who comes with as much emotional baggage as I carry. I'm not the same man I was before Rebecca died, and I may never be that person again." Elena reached out and touched Jake's hand, feeling the calluses and scars that spoke of years of hard physical work and mountain living. "I'm not the same woman I was before my husband abandoned our family either. We're both different people than we were before life taught us how much it can hurt, but maybe that's not necessarily a bad thing. Maybe we're stronger and more compassionate because of what we've survived." Jake turned his hand to capture Elena's fingers in his grip warm and steady and reassuring. "I never thought I'd be able to care about someone again the way I cared about Rebecca. I thought that part of me died with her. But yesterday when I saw your car on that road, and last night when we talked by the fire, I felt something I'd given up hope of ever feeling again." Elena's heart began racing as she understood what Jake was trying to tell her. "What did you feel?" she asked softly, needing to hear the words even though she thought she already knew the answer. "I felt like I wanted to protect someone again, not just out of duty but because they mattered to me personally. I felt like I wanted to share my life with someone instead of just enduring it alone." Jake's admission was quiet but filled with the weight of 3 years' worth of isolation and grief. Elena felt tears threatening again, but this time they were tears of joy rather than sorrow or relief. "I felt something too, something I didn't think I'd ever feel again after my marriage ended so badly. I felt safe with you, not just physically but emotionally. I felt like I could be completely honest about my struggles and my fears without worrying that you would judge me or abandon me." Jake lifted his free hand to touch Elena's face with a gentleness that contradicted his reputation as a hardened mountain hermit. "Elena, I need you to know that whatever develops between us, your children will always come first. I understand that you're a package deal, and I would never ask you to choose between your family and anything else." Elena leaned into Jake's touch, feeling more cherished in this single moment than she had during her entire marriage. "Sofia and Tommy are going to love having you as a neighbor. They've been asking about you since yesterday, wondering when they'll get to meet the man who saved their mama from the storm. I'd like to meet them too, Jake said with a smile that transformed his entire face. I've never been around children much, but if they're anything like their mother, I think we'll get along just fine. Elena could see that Jake was both excited and nervous about the prospect of being part of a family again, even in an unofficial capacity. The radio crackled to life, interrupting their conversation with an update from Deputy Sheriff Morrison. Jake, this is Morrison. We've got Frank in custody and the situation is secure. The roads are clear enough for travel if you want to bring Elena back to town. Her kids are asking for her and I think she'll want to see the evidence we've collected against my brother. Jake walked to the radio and keyed the microphone. We'll head down within the hour, Sheriff. Elena's eager to see her children and get this whole situation resolved. He glanced at Elena as he spoke, and she nodded her agreement with the plan. One more thing, Jake, the radio crackled. I know you've been keeping an eye on the Chen property during the winter. Elena's going to want to see her new house as soon as possible and I was hoping you could show her around the place. Nobody knows that property better than you do. Elena felt her heart skip at the confirmation that Jake had been caring for her inherited property without even knowing she existed. You've been taking care of my house all this time, she asked as Jake set down the microphone. Margaret Chen was a good neighbor and a kind woman, Jake explained. After she died, I felt obligated to make sure her property didn't fall into disrepair while the lawyers sorted out her estate. I never imagined I was maintaining a house for the woman I'd end up rescuing from a blizzard. Elena shook her head in amazement at the interconnected nature of recent events. So you've been protecting my inheritance while I've been struggling to pay rent on a house owned by a criminal who was trying to drive me out of town. If that's not fate, I don't know what is. As they prepared to leave Jake's cabin and return to Pine Ridge, Elena felt a sense of anticipation she hadn't experienced in years. Not just excitement about seeing her children and claiming her inheritance, but hope for a future that might include the kind of love and partnership she'd thought was impossible after her marriage failed so spectacularly. Jake loaded her overnight bag into his truck and helped her into the passenger seat with the same careful attention he'd shown during the rescue operation. But now his protectiveness felt different, less like duty and more like the beginning of something that could grow into real love if they were both brave enough to let it develop. The drive down the mountain was spectacular in the clear morning air, with snow-covered peaks rising all around them like cathedral spires reaching toward heaven. Elena found herself looking forward to making this journey regularly as Jake's neighbor, sharing morning coffee and evening conversations with a man who understood both strength and vulnerability. Are you ready for this? Jake asked as Pine Ridge came into view below them, the small town looking peaceful and innocent in the morning sunlight despite the drama that had unfolded overnight. Elena looked at Jake's profile as he navigated the winding mountain road, seeing not just the hermit who'd saved her life but the man who might become part of her family's future. I'm ready for whatever comes next, she said with confidence that surprised her with its strength. For the first time in years I feel like my children and I are exactly where we're supposed to be. As Jake's truck rolled into Pine Ridge and Elena prepared to reunite with Sofia and Tommy, she reflected on how dramatically her life had changed in less than 24 hours. Yesterday she'd been a desperate woman making dangerous choices to save her family from homelessness. Today she was a property owner with financial security, romantic possibilities and a future that looked brighter than anything she'd dared to imagine. The storm that had nearly killed her had instead delivered her into the hands of a man who might become the love of her life, revealed criminal activity that would bring justice for her family, and led to the discovery of an inheritance that would transform their circumstances forever. Sometimes salvation came disguised as disaster, and sometimes the gentleness you thought was lost forever was just waiting for the right person to help you find it again. Elena Rodriguez had come to the mountains looking for survival and found something much more precious, a chance at the kind of happiness she'd stopped believing was possible for women like her. And Jake Thompson, the mountain man who hadn't been gentle since his wife died, was about to discover that love didn't end with loss, sometimes it just waited patiently for the right moment to begin again. 6 months later, Elena stood on the wraparound porch of her inherited house watching Jake teach Tommy how to split firewood with the patient precision of a man who understood that some lessons were about more than just practical skills. The morning sun painted the snow-capped peaks surrounding their mountain valley in shades of rose and gold, and Elena never tired of the spectacular view that greeted her each dawn from her new home. The house Margaret Chen had left her was everything Jake had promised and more, a craftsman-style mountain lodge with soaring ceilings, massive stone fireplaces and windows designed to showcase the breathtaking scenery that surrounded them on all sides. The property included a guest cabin, a workshop and 20 acres of pristine wilderness that provided complete privacy while still being close enough to Pine Ridge for the children to attend school and Elena to maintain her connections to the community. Tommy's excited voice carried across the yard as he successfully split his first log under Jake's careful supervision. "Did you see that, Mama? I did it just like Jake showed me." The 7-year-old's face glowed with pride and accomplishment, and Elena's heart swelled with gratitude for the positive male influence Jake had become in her son's life. "I saw it, sweetheart. You're getting very strong and very skilled," Elena called back, then turned her attention to Sofia, who was sitting cross-legged on the porch beside her, working on a watercolor painting of the mountain vista. At 9 years old, Sofia had embraced the artistic opportunities her new life provided with enthusiasm that reminded Elena of Rebecca's creative spirit. Sofia looked up from her painting with the serious expression that had become more frequent since their lives had stabilized and she'd had time to process all the changes they'd experienced. "Mama, do you think Jake is going to ask you to marry him soon? Tommy and I have been talking about it and we think it would be really nice if he became our official stepdad instead of just our neighbor who acts like a dad." Elena felt her cheeks warm at her daughter's directness, though she'd been wondering the same thing herself as her relationship with Jake deepened and evolved over the months since the storm that had brought them together. "What makes you think Jake wants to marry me, sweetheart? We're very good friends, but marriage is a big step that requires careful thought and planning." "Because he looks at you the way Daddy used to look at his phone," Sofia replied with the devastating honesty that only children could deliver. "Except Jake looks at you like you're the most important thing in the whole world, and Daddy looked at his phone like it was more interesting than his family. Also, Jake fixed our broken bathroom sink last week even though it wasn't his responsibility, and he always makes sure we have enough firewood and that our generator is working properly." Elena was struck by her daughter's perceptive observations about the differences between Jake's attentive care and her ex-husband's emotional absence. Sofia had articulated something Elena had been feeling but hadn't quite put into words, that Jake's love felt fundamentally different from anything she'd experienced before, based on genuine care and commitment rather than convenience or obligation. "Jake is a very good man who cares about our family," Elena agreed carefully. "But love and marriage are complicated things, and sometimes adults need more time to figure out their feelings and make sure they're making the right decisions for everyone involved." Sofia nodded solemnly, then returned to her painting with the matter-of-fact acceptance that characterized her approach to most adult mysteries. "Well, when you and Jake do get married, can we have the wedding here on our property? I think it would be beautiful with all the mountains and flowers, and Jake's cabin is close enough that he wouldn't have to travel far for the ceremony." Elena smiled at her daughter's confidence that marriage was inevitable rather than merely possible, though privately she found herself hoping Sofia's prediction would prove accurate. The months since discovering her inheritance and moving to the mountain house had been the happiest of Elena's adult life, filled with the kind of domestic contentment and romantic possibility she'd stopped believing could exist for women like her. Jake had been incredibly patient about their developing relationship, never pushing for more intimacy or commitment than Elena was ready to offer, but making his feelings clear through countless small gestures and daily acts of service that meant more than grand romantic declarations. He'd helped her move into the new house, taught both children essential mountain living skills, and gradually become such an integral part of their daily routine that Elena couldn't imagine life without his steady presence. The legal proceedings against Frank Morrison had concluded with his conviction on multiple charges, including attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy to commit various crimes against vulnerable residents throughout the county. His sentencing had brought closure not just for Elena's family but for dozens of other victims who'd suffered under his discriminatory practices. Deputy Sheriff Morrison had been promoted to sheriff following his brother's disgrace, and he'd made reforming the county's approach to housing discrimination a top priority of his administration. Elena's financial situation had been completely transformed by her great-aunt's bequest, but she'd chosen to continue working part-time at Murphy's Diner because she enjoyed the community connections and wanted to maintain her independence rather than relying entirely on inherited wealth. The trust fund Margaret Chen had established would ensure that Sofia and Tommy could attend any college they chose and pursue their dreams without the financial constraints that had limited Elena's own opportunities. Tommy's triumphant shout interrupted her reverie as he successfully split another log, this one even more cleanly than his previous attempt. "Jake says I'm a natural at this. He says by next winter I'll be able to help him cut all our firewood for both houses." The boy's enthusiasm for outdoor work and practical skills had blossomed under Jake's mentorship, giving him confidence and competence that complemented the artistic sensitivity he'd inherited from his mother. Elena watched Jake ruffle Tommy's hair with obvious affection, and her heart clenched with love for this man who'd embraced her children as if they were his own biological offspring. Jake had never had children with Rebecca, and Elena could see that teaching Tommy and Sofia was healing something deep inside him while giving her kids the stable father figure they'd been missing since their biological father's abandonment. The sound of an approaching vehicle drew Elena's attention to the winding driveway that connected their property to the main road. A familiar pickup truck emerged from the trees, Deputy Sheriff Morrison making one of his regular welfare checks that had become friendly social visits rather than official police business. Elena had grown fond of the man whose integrity had saved her family from his brother's criminal schemes. "Good morning, Rodriguez family and honorary family member Thompson," Sheriff Morrison called out as he climbed out of his truck, his greeting carrying the warmth of genuine friendship rather than professional courtesy. "Beautiful day for outdoor activities. Tommy, I can see your wood-cutting skills are really improving." Tommy beamed at the recognition from one of his heroes, and Elena reflected on how much her son had thrived since gaining positive male role models in Jake and Sheriff Morrison. "Thank you, Sheriff Morrison. Jake says I might be ready to use the chainsaw next year if I keep practicing and following all the safety rules." "That's excellent progress," Morrison replied seriously, understanding that being treated like a capable young man rather than a child was important to Tommy's developing sense of self-worth. "Jake's one of the best teachers you could have for outdoor skills. He taught half the search and rescue volunteers in this county before he retired from active duty." Elena noticed Jake's slight wince at the mention of his former search and rescue career, a reminder that he still carried guilt about stepping away from that work after Rebecca's death. She'd been gently encouraging him to consider returning to volunteer rescue work, believing that helping others was an essential part of who Jake was as a person. Sheriff Morrison approached the porch where Elena and Sofia were sitting, accepting the offer of coffee with the grateful enthusiasm of a man who spent long days managing the complexities of rural law enforcement. "Actually, I have some news that might interest both of you," he said, settling into one of the comfortable porch chairs that Jake had built to complement the house's rustic architecture. "Good news or complicated news?" Elena asked, having learned that in Pine Ridge, most news fell into one of those two categories. "Good news, I think, though it comes with some interesting possibilities that you'll want to discuss as a family," Morrison replied, glancing meaningfully at Jake, who had finished the woodcutting lesson and joined them on the porch. "We've received federal funding to establish a new mountain rescue training center here in Pine Ridge, and the grant specifically requests that Jake Thompson be offered the position of head instructor." Elena felt excitement and concern warring in her chest as she processed Morrison's announcement. Jake returning to rescue work would be wonderful for his emotional healing and the community's safety, but it would also mean him taking risks that could result in the kind of loss that had devastated him when Rebecca died. Jake's expression was carefully neutral as he absorbed Morrison's words, but Elena could see the internal struggle playing out behind his controlled facade. "I appreciate the offer, Sheriff, but I'm not sure I'm ready to be responsible for other people's lives again. My judgment hasn't been tested in emergency situations for over 3 years." "Your judgment saved Elena's life 6 months ago," Morrison pointed out gently, "and your experience and knowledge are exactly what this program needs to be successful. The federal grant is specifically designed to improve mountain rescue capabilities in remote areas like ours, and frankly, you're the most qualified person in a 100-mile radius." Elena reached over and took Jake's hand, squeezing gently to let him know she supported whatever decision he made about his professional future. What would this position involve? Would Jake be doing actual rescues, or primarily training other people to do rescue work? "Primarily training," Morrison explained, though head instructors are expected to participate in complex rescue operations when their expertise is specifically needed. The program would train volunteers from throughout the region, including specialized techniques for winter rescues, high-altitude emergencies, and coordination with helicopter evacuation services. Sofia looked up from her painting with the directness that characterized her approach to adult conversations. "Would this job make Jake happy? Because if it would make him happy, then we want him to do it, even if it means he has to help people who get lost in the mountains." Elena felt tears prick her eyes at her daughter's intuitive understanding that Jake's happiness mattered to their family, and that supporting the people you love sometimes meant encouraging them to take risks that frightened you. "What do you think, Jake? Would this kind of work bring you satisfaction and purpose?" Jake was quiet for a long moment, his gaze moving between Elena's supportive expression, the children who'd come to depend on him, and the magnificent mountain scenery that had been both blessing and curse in his life. "I think Rebecca would want me to help people again," he said finally. "And I think I'm ready to stop punishing myself for not being able to save her. Teaching other people how to save lives might be the best way to honor her memory." Elena felt a surge of love and pride for Jake's courage in choosing growth over safety, purpose over protection. "Then I think you should accept the position. Sofia and Tommy and I will be proud to have a mountain rescue instructor in our family, and Pine Ridge will be safer because of your willingness to share your knowledge and experience." Sheriff Morrison smiled with obvious relief at Jake's decision. Excellent. The program starts this fall, which gives us several months to set up facilities and recruit trainees. Jake, you'll have input on all the equipment purchases and training protocols, and the salary is generous enough that you won't have to worry about financial security while you're building the program. Tommy abandoned his wood pile and ran to the porch with the enthusiasm that characterized his approach to everything that involved Jake. Does this mean you're going to teach people how to save lives like you saved Mama? That's the best job ever. His wholehearted approval of Jake's career direction brought smiles to all the adults present. It means I'm going to try to teach people the skills they need to help others who get into trouble in the mountains, Jake replied seriously. It's important work, but it's also dangerous work that requires careful training and lots of practice to do safely. Elena could see that Jake was already mentally transitioning into instructor mode, thinking about curriculum development and safety protocols, with the focused intensity that characterized his approach to everything he considered important. She felt grateful that he'd found a way to return to meaningful work without abandoning the family life they'd built together. As Sheriff Morrison finished his coffee and prepared to leave, he glanced meaningfully between Jake and Elena with the expression of someone who had something else to say but wasn't sure how to bring it up. There's one other thing I wanted to mention, though this is more personal observation than official business. Elena felt her stomach flutter with anticipation at Morrison's tone, wondering what kind of personal observation he felt compelled to share with them. What's on your mind, Sheriff? I've been watching you two navigate this relationship for 6 months now, and I've never seen two people who were more obviously meant for each other taking so long to make things official, Morrison said with the blunt kindness that characterized his approach to most interpersonal situations. I'm not saying you should rush into anything, but I am saying that the whole town is rooting for you to figure out that you belong together permanently. Elena felt her cheeks burn with embarrassment and pleasure at Morrison's public endorsement of their relationship. She glanced at Jake and saw him smiling with the kind of genuine happiness that had been absent from his expressions for years before she'd entered his life. Sheriff Morrison, Jake said with mock formality, are you suggesting that I need to propose to Elena before the town starts taking bets on our wedding date? I'm suggesting that if you don't propose soon I might have to arrest you for disturbing the peace, because the entire female population of Pine Ridge is driving me crazy with questions about when you're going to make an honest woman out of our favorite waitress. Morrison replied with a grin that took any sting out of his words. Sofia looked up from her painting with the satisfied expression of someone whose predictions were being vindicated. I told Mama you were going to ask her to marry you soon. Adults always take forever to figure out things that are obvious to kids. Tommy nodded sagely in agreement with his sister's assessment. Yeah, Jake practically lives here already, and he always makes sure we have everything we need, and he fixes things when they're broken, and he teaches us important stuff. That's what dads do, so he might as well be our official dad instead of just acting like one. Elena found herself laughing at her children's matter-of-fact analysis of their family situation, though their words made her heart race with hope for the future they were describing. You two have certainly given this a lot of thought, she observed. We talk about it sometimes when you and Jake are busy doing adult things, Sofia admitted. We decided that if Jake becomes our stepdad, we want to keep our last name but also use his name sometimes, like Sofia Rodriguez Thompson for special occasions. That way we remember our first dad, but also show that Jake is part of our family now. Elena felt tears threatening at her daughter's thoughtful approach to the complex emotions involved in blended families, and she glanced at Jake to see how he was responding to the children's casual assumption that he would become their stepfather. Jake's expression was soft with emotion as he looked at Sofia and Tommy, and Elena could see that their acceptance and love had healed something in him that he'd thought was permanently broken. If your mother agrees to marry me, he said carefully, I would be honored to be your stepfather, and I think Rodriguez Thompson sounds like a perfect name for special occasions. Elena felt her world shift and realign around Jake's careful proposal, delivered not with grand romantic gestures, but with the steady sincerity that characterized everything he did. Jake Thompson, she said slowly, savoring the moment, are you asking me to marry you in front of my children and the sheriff of Pine Ridge County?
Elena Rodriguez, Jake replied,
moving from his chair to kneel beside hers in a gesture that was both traditional and perfectly suited to their unconventional courtship. I'm asking you to marry me, to build a life together, to let me love your children as my own, and to help me become the man Rebecca always believed I could be. Will you take a chance on a reformed hermit with a lot of baggage and a new job teaching people how to save lives? Elena felt tears flowing freely as she looked into Jake's honest gray eyes, and saw a future filled with love, security, and the kind of partnership she'd stopped believing was possible.
Yes, she said simply.
Then louder, yes, I'll marry you, Jake Thompson. I'll take a chance on building something beautiful with a man who's proven that gentleness and strength can coexist, that love can survive loss, and that sometimes the best families are the ones we choose for ourselves. Sofia and Tommy erupted in cheers and ran to embrace their soon-to-be stepfather, while Sheriff Morrison applauded and announced that he'd be honored to officiate their wedding ceremony if they wanted to keep things local and family-focused. Elena found herself surrounded by the people who mattered most to her, overwhelmed with gratitude for the series of events that had brought them all together. As Jake slipped a simple gold ring onto her finger, Rebecca's ring, offered with his late wife's blessing according to the letter he'd found among her personal effects, Elena reflected on the journey that had brought her from desperation to joy, from isolation to belonging, from survival to thriving. The mountain man who hadn't been gentle since his wife died, had found his way back to tenderness through love for a woman and children who needed his strength and gave him purpose in return. Elena Rodriguez had come to Pine Ridge looking for a fresh start, and found instead a destiny she never could have imagined, complete with inherited wealth, true love, and a family that proved blood wasn't the only bond that mattered. 1 year later, Elena stood in the same spot on her porch, now as Mrs. Elena Rodriguez Thompson, watching her husband teach mountain rescue techniques to a group of eager volunteers while their children played safely in the yard under the watchful eyes of Sheriff Morrison's wife. The rescue training center had become nationally recognized for its excellence, and Jake had found his calling in preparing others to save lives while building a life with the family who'd saved his heart. The mountains that had taken Rebecca Thompson had given Jake a second chance at love, proving that sometimes loss was just the universe's way of preparing you for the gift you never knew you needed. Elena had learned that gentleness wasn't weakness, that strength came in many forms, and that the most beautiful love stories began not with passion but with one person choosing to care for another, when caring required courage. Their wedding had been held on the property where they'd built their life together, surrounded by the peaks that had witnessed their courtship, and the community that had embraced their unconventional family. Jake had spoken his vows with the same steady sincerity that characterized everything he did, promising to love Elena's children as his own, and to build with her the kind of partnership that honored both their individual strengths and their shared commitment to family. Sofia and Tommy had grown into confident, capable young people under Jake's patient guidance, learning not just practical mountain skills but the deeper lessons about integrity, compassion, and the responsibility that came with strength. They'd never forgotten their biological father, but they'd found in Jake the kind of steady, dependable love that formed the foundation of secure childhoods. Elena had discovered that her great-aunt Margaret's gift was about more than just financial security. It was about the freedom to choose love over fear, hope over despair, and family over solitude. The house on the mountain had become not just shelter but sanctuary, a place where wounded hearts could heal, and new dreams could take root, in soil enriched by loss and fertilized by faith. As the sun set behind the peaks that surrounded their valley, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that reminded Elena of the morning she'd first seen this view from Jake's cabin, she felt the deep contentment that came from knowing she was exactly where she belonged. The mountain man had found love again, and in doing so he'd given a lonely woman and her children the family they'd been searching for without even knowing it. Sometimes salvation came disguised as disaster, sometimes strength revealed itself through gentleness, and sometimes the love you thought was lost forever was just waiting patiently for the right moment to begin again. In the shadow of the Colorado Rockies, two broken hearts had learned to beat in harmony, proving that the most beautiful stories weren't always the ones that began with happily ever after, but the ones that found their way there through courage, kindness, and the willing choice to love again despite the risk of loss. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.